Hello, and welcome to another episode of Game Develop Repeat, the podcast where we talk about a game that I enjoy, what makes it special, and what we, as game developers, can learn from it. I'm your host, Chris, a music educator turned indie game developer, and today's episode is all about Age of Mythology. In this episode, we discuss the impact of your game's setting, the game's emotional intent, and the problem with cloning games. Let's get to it. I never quite got into Age of Empires. I played it a little bit, but I never got so deep into it. So many people absolutely love it, and admittedly, amazing series. Extremely good, really high quality. Never quite clicked for me. Every once in a while, I try to sink my teeth into it, and then I can't quite get there. I don't know what it is about it. Age of Mythology, I went pretty deep down the Age of Mythology rabbit hole for a while. I think I may have beaten the campaign. So here's my pitch for it. It's like, basically, if you're like me and you feel like you should like Age of Empires, but you don't, it might be worth giving it a shot. It's like if you took Age of Empires and you focused it a little bit more on having distinct play styles for each, like, I'm going to just say faction. I don't remember the actual words that they use in the game for the teams that you're playing. And a distinct playstyle for each god that you are worshiping. So your choices of god have a more powerful impact on your playstyle and your units availability and all this stuff. And I like it. So that's the basics of it. We don't actually have to dig that deep into it. The lore feels different, obviously, because it's based on mythology, and what I'm really wanting to talk about in this episode is how the choice of setting has had a huge effect on this game, and how the choice of setting might have a huge effect on other games. So let's just do a little more of this comparison between Age of Mythology and Age of Empires. When I play Age of Empires, it is trying to have an impact on me through a historical setting. It is trying to pull me in and say, hey, look, you are like a part of history right now. You are involved in this. You are helping navigate like the shaping of the world as it is now. That's how I view it, at least. Maybe that's part of why I don't like it. Maybe somebody who loves the game will be like, oh, that's not how I see it at all. And maybe that's part of the issue. But I play it and it feels like I am managing armies. It feels very historical. It feels very like almost, it's crazy to call a game realistic, but it feels like it's aiming for like some sense of like realistic governorship, like some kind of militaristic thing, right? Like it feels a bit more grounded in reality. Age of Mythology is much more of this like fantasy feeling, this fantasy setting. And it changes a couple things. One, the gameplay can feel a little wilder. You can do some weird stuff. You can have like a Cyclops throw in something. You can go out there with the armies that you are recruiting, right? Whenever I play Age of Empires, it just feels a little too everybody's a human. When I play Age of Mythology, it's like, oh, I know exactly how to counter that thing because it looks so different from what I'm using, right? And then as far as the emotional impact of all of this, I feel like I'm entering this like fantasy world when I'm playing Age of Mythology. It feels like I'm playing this completely different thing from real life. And something about Age of Empires is just a little too close to real life for me. And once again, I want to reiterate this. Age of Empires, fantastic series. It just, for some reason, it doesn't always click for me. And when I play it, I enjoy it. It's just I never get sucked into it. And it feels like a game that I'm supposed to get sucked into because it's like in the genre that I love. It's all this stuff. And it doesn't quite do it for me. And I think part of it is this like mythological vibe. Like I was deeper into Warcraft 3 than I ever was into StarCraft just because of this setting thing. And so that's why I want to really explore today how big of a difference setting alone makes. And we'll go through some thought experiments about just like if you were to change the setting of a game. And I've even got a couple examples I can pull from of like games that did that and how it affected the game and like what's going on there. The story is going to be significantly different in these games, right? And I kind of like that. I like a weird story. I like a story to be very unrealistic, you know. I like things to get pretty out there. The more grounded it is, it seems like the less interested I am. And these are just my quirks. This is not stating anything about the value of these types of stories. This is like my own personal preferences. But I always want to be really into it. I got into Civilization for a little while, and I do like the grand scale of that story, but I think like that's the kind of thing where once again the setting just changes it for me, and I think something more like a Warhammer, like a more fantasy setting would do the trick for me, whereas Civilization is just a little too grounded in reality. But there is something super appealing about this, like you are shaping history itself, right? Um, Empire Earth is a game that has a slightly different setting from Age of Empires. It's kind of, um, I'm kind of going down a war strategy rabbit hole here, but it is relevant. Empire Earth is like if you took Age of Empires and like exploded the scope into the future and the past in this massive scale of like prehistoric era all the way to like far reaching future. That's really cool. I like that one a lot. That's like the best version of, for me, of the Age of Empires vibe. Now that game is wildly imbalanced and there are some problems with it, but God, it's a good game. If Age of Empires let you go deep into the past and deep into the future, that changes the entire feeling for me. That's how nitty gritty these like setting details can get. Are you locked into 100 years or are you going across 500 years? Can you get to the point where you have tanks, right? If you can get to the point where you have tanks, it's a whole different game. If the whole game is locked into the prehistoric era, it's an entirely different feeling. And that affects everything about the game. And I think it's easy to just say like, "Oh, what if this game but in this time period?" But then it's like, how does that actually have an impact? How big is the impact of the setting on the game? Let's go ahead and start talking about some of these thought experiments I have for this. The first thought experiment is, can you take a game, change the setting, and keep the gameplay identical without having it feel weird? My proposal is no, you cannot. Unless the settings are extremely similar or you've just hit like a 1 in a million shot. I think generally speaking, if you take a game, change the setting, and keep the gameplay exactly the same, there's gonna be something about it that doesn't quite feel right. There's gonna be some balance. There's gonna be something. If you just fully reskin the game, there's just gonna be this underlying feeling of like something's wonky. Can I fully back that up? I mean, this is my instinct on it. We're gonna go through this. We're gonna see if let's try and like flesh this out a little bit. All right. My first thought is, if you take a sci-fi shooter, let's say you take like Warframe. I like Warframe. That's a great game. It's a free game. It's good. So much content there. I no longer have time for Warframe. But if you were to take Warframe and turn it into a fantasy game, get rid of all the sci-fi elements and turn it into just high fantasy, that's going to change everything. That game is built from the bottom up with all of these crazy gameplay mechanics. And just by changing, I mean, this is such a large scale game that maybe it's a bad example, but just by changing that vibe, you're changing the interplanetary stuff is going to have to change to like some kind of far portal thing, right? Like you can do it. All of the like the war frames are going to have to change to some kind of like a summoning thing. Like you can get it to work, but it's going to change the feeling of the game so dramatically. And as far as the shooting goes, it can't feel as like, you can't be running along walls, right? And it can't feel as like as tight and quick, and like with that variety of guns, it's gonna have to feel different. Um I think, but maybe I'm wrong. Like, how cool would a fantasy version of Warframe be? But things would have to change, right? Like, there's no way that the gameplay would end up feeling the same, right? That's my theory. But that, like, now I'm kind of talking myself out of it. But I think you just have to change the gameplay if you change the setting, like, to some degree. And I'm not saying dramatically. That's that I need to make that key distinction here. I don't think everything about the gameplay will change, but I do think that if you just copy paste the gameplay, you're gonna be missing something. I think the setting is going to influence the gameplay. It's gonna feel weird, and you got to be really creative to make it not feel weird. Here's an example. Stardew Valley. We are all familiar with Stardew Valley, I'm sure. Versus Graveyard Keeper. This is something that I think is really cool. So Graveyard Keeper has a lot of similarities to Stardew Valley, right? It's not a farming game. It is a very different game. Um but they have the same general genre. If you were to take Stardew Valley and be make it be as dark as Graveyard Keeper, something's gotta give. And it's going to change the feeling of your interactions with the villagers. It's going to change the feeling of your interactions with the stores. It's going to change the way that you're farming things. It's going to change the friendliness of everything. And then the whole game feels completely different. And then in terms of actual gameplay, if you were just doing the same gameplay loop of like cheerful fishing, some mining, watering plants, and like giving people gifts, it's not going to feel right if it's got this really, really dark aesthetic, right? Everything has to change a little bit. Is this just like a butterfly effect episode, and I just don't know exactly what the butterfly effect is in this? Like, my feeling, I think the thing I'm getting at is like every small detail has an impact on other elements of your game, and a major detail like setting has a significant impact, but we don't think like there's this thing I'm doing in my brain every time I talk about a different game with a different setting. I feel like I can make it work, and then I'm like, wait, but what is changing? What is actually changing? Like, if I take Stardew Valley and I make it into just a really dark, gritty thing where you are like farming poisonous plants or something, right? And you're like, I don't know, immediately it starts to change dramatically. Like, you're no longer selling these plants to people in order for them to make meals. You're no longer giving somebody a gift for them to cook a meal. Now you're giving them a gift for them to make a potion to poison somebody, right? Or, like, if it gets dark, what you're farming has to change. If what you're farming changes, people's reactions to that changes. What you're fishing changes. What you fighting in the mines changes. Maybe you're going above world instead of going underground. Maybe it's like an underground Stardew. See, it quickly spirals for me and changes the entire thing. And maybe you could do a hard clone and just like change the vibe, but I don't think so. And this is where I get into something that I think about a lot, which is when a game is wildly successful, like extremely successful, everybody starts cloning it, right? When Warcraft 3 was huge, when StarCraft was huge, whenever one of these war strategies was huge, the genre exploded. It became a huge thing. When a shooter did well, shooters have become like a perpetual thing now. Better example, when Stardew popped off, everybody's suddenly making cute games. Everybody's making Stardew clones. Everybody's going right after that market. There are two issues here. One is just the issue of like, yeah, but I mean, look, people want more of that, but what are you bringing to the table? Like, now it's going to get crowded. It's a whole thing, right? We all remember the era of puzzle platformers, indie puzzle platformers, right? Still an oversaturated market to this day, probably. there are these phases where like one game comes out and then everybody imitates it. And the thing that I'm running into here is if you just do a straight up copy of the game, right? And just like reskin it a little bit, change a couple things, whatever. I think the other huge issue with it is, and this is putting aside any kind of like ethical, like this is setting aside a lot of concerns. One of the reasons why I don't think it's a successful move is you're going to ignore a lot of the small changes and you're going to be blind to a lot of the small changes that need to happen in order for the game to fully fit your reskin, right? You're going to go, oh, well, I just want to make Stardew Valley, but now it's fairies or something, right? Or like cats or like whatever. And if you're really killing it, you're going to pay attention to what that implies and you're going to change all these little details, and that's where you get like a pretty good clone. You get something where somebody was inspired heavily by it and then they go, oh, I want to build something kind of like that, but I have this whole different idea, versus the corporate clone, which is that was successful, let's make that but with our budget and we'll just change these things, and then the changes don't affect everything, and it no longer feels like one cohesive game. It no longer feels like beginning to end, one project, one idea, one beautiful, smooth experience where everything kind of makes sense. And I think that comes down to not understanding what the game is trying to accomplish. And when you change the setting, that maybe that's what I'm getting at. When you change the setting of a game, it changes everything that the game is trying to accomplish. I think that's it. Because when you change the setting, you're changing how it's trying to make somebody feel. And when you change how it tried to make somebody feel, like I think I've talked about this before, I think gameplay has a fundamental emotional impact, right? So if you're keeping the gameplay but changing the emotion that you're trying to evoke, then what are you doing? Right? Like if that gameplay contributes to evoking that emotion and you're able to kind of twist it and turn it and get it to be like a good solid fit, perfect, beautiful. But the gameplay, and I'm going to just keep coming back to, I know we were talking about Age of Mythology and Age of Empires initially, and somehow I've gone down this Stardew example, but we're going to stick with it for a second. If you change, like you look at Stardew and the emotion that it's trying to evoke is like this chill, calm town vibe with like growth and development and connection and bonding, right? That's my feeling about it. If you were to make it really gritty, then the emotion that you're trying to evoke is completely different. And the gameplay mechanic of being patient and growing things and selling them to people and like all these connective things have they have a very specific emotion that they're going for. The mechanics themselves contribute to an emotional impact. And now let's tie this back to Age of Mythology, since that is technically what this episode is about. Age of Mythology has an emotional impact to me of entering a different world. They're trying to pull you into a different world. They're trying to pull you into this mythology, into this, like, it's trying to immerse you into kind of a fantasy world. Age of Empires is trying to immerse you into something much more realistic. And I think that both of them execute beautifully, right? I don't think Age of Mythology is any kind of just like reskin. I think it is its own game for sure. And I think part of the reason it succeeds at that is because it understands its goals and it brings you in on those goals. It focuses in on story in a very specific way. It focuses in on like God choice in a very specific way and worship and all these things. Is totally different from Age of Empires, which focuses really well on its own goals and executes beautifully on its goals. And I think that the setting contributes so heavily to the goals of the game, which then informs all of the game design decisions. And if you create a game in a different setting, but borrow somebody else's goals and don't pay attention to how those goals have changed, you're going to run into problems because you're just going to go, oh, this is a good game with good gameplay. And then you're going to put a whole different skin on top of it. And it's going to be like a weird skinwalker situation where people play your game and you're like, I don't know what's wrong, but something's wrong. This is not right. This isn't correct. This doesn't feel right. I think that's the issue with cloning games, other than all the other issues of like oversaturation of the market and like kind of getting stale, uninspired games, ethical issues with giant companies trying to kind of, piggyback off of small indies that got. There's a whole bunch of stuff. There's a whole bunch of weird stuff that I can't even, I don't even know what is and isn't an ethical issue in that conversation. But that is where we're at with that. I think that's everything I have to say about setting. I think for today, at least, I think the biggest thing with the setting is that it needs to be a part of your emotional goal in the game. I've had some really fun game ideas, which I have pitched on another podcast that I contribute to called the Distinguished Humans Indie Game Dev Club. I think I got that right. It's kind of a long title, but I do like a 5-minute segment for them where I pitch a game idea. And I've had several where I love the setting, but I look at it and I go, that setting forces me into a huge scope. So I don't want to do it, right? Like I come up with some really cool idea and I'm like, there's so much art involved. There's so much, like, in order to make this game good, the scope is massive and I'm not ready to do that idea justice. Anyway, a little bit of a tangent there. Let's talk about my development really quickly. I have had 24 hours since I recorded the last episode because I'm going on a trip next weekend and won't have time to record. So as far as my own development goes, all I have done is spend like 4 hours working on Unreal Engine. I'm starting just like learning it in my spare time on the weekends. So I spent some time learning Unreal Engine. I am excited about it. I'm interested. I'm coming up with 3D game ideas. I've got a cool little shooter idea that I'm excited about. I've got a couple different angles on it. I might actually make it like more of a top-down, like a kind of a. It might not be first person. I don't know. I don't really like first person shooters, which is why it might be an interesting challenge for me and a really good learning experience. And then I could dig into the genre and study it and play a bunch of them, kind of like what I did with platformers. And then that would be cool. That might give me more to talk about on this show too, like some nice, interesting, fresh conversation topics. So I started learning that. And then I also jumped into Blender just to just start getting the slightest of ideas of how to navigate it, because I'm not going to be able to do pixel art if I do a 3D game, and I love doing pixel art, so it kind of makes me sad. That's one of the biggest kind of drawbacks for me from this whole Unity thing is like I was ready to just dig into Unity and do like some cool pixel art stuff and like whatever, and I would go to Godot, but I don't want I want to learn an industry standard tool, basically. I want to have the job opportunities open to me, and Unreal looks really good on the resume, and there's cool things I can do with it. I'm excited about it. I'm just a little sad that at the moment I'm not going to be able to do pixel art in it. I mean, there are ways, fine, cool, but my understanding is that it's better for 3D in general, so I want to learn the 3D, and then I can start doing weird stuff with it and working on 2D projects if I want to, or I can pick up Godot as well. All right, that's everything I've got about my development. Let's go ahead and get to the end of this episode. Questions to help you with your development. First question: what games or game inspired your game? Next question. Oh, I've got to answer these. What inspired Soot? I think Celeste was probably the biggest inspiration. Other than that, like Super Meat Boy, a couple of these major platformers. Oh, I'm answering these on the fly today. What is different about your game, and is it affecting gameplay? Yeah, I think for me, the game's theming is like it's about a ball of soot, right? Like, and that affected it a lot. It made me go, oh, what if I can stick to things? And like the visuals, I intentionally picked a theme that allows me to go very like low fidelity on the visuals because I'm building up my art skills. And so I was just like, oh, let's just make it cute. So yeah, I've kept it very simple because like the theming allows me to have only a couple different enemy types, and it has like a climbing feel to it. I wanted the game to be much more vertical than it is, which is actually very similar to Celeste. But because of the way the gameplay played out, I ended up going, oh, this actually shouldn't be that vertical. It becomes a little too samey if it's very vertical, even though thematically I like the verticality of it. I do think the game might have more emotional impact if it was a much more climbing game, because I did want it to be like about this ball of soot getting out of a fireplace. Like that was part of the initial idea. And I do think if it was a little bit more vertical, I might be able to have more impact, but I would have to design things pretty differently, and I like how it's played out. So I'm sticking with what I got because it's basically done. Yeah, that's where I'm at on that one. I go a lot longer when I answer these off the top of the dome. Next question: should it be affecting gameplay? The differences between your game and the game that inspired it. Should those differences be affecting gameplay? My answer is just yes. For me, at least. For this game, yeah, absolutely. It's different enough that yes, definitely. Lastly, is your game's setting or lore being acted out sufficiently? There's more to me. Like in my mind, there's more that I would like to have in there. I'd like there to feel like there's some backstory to the character, but for this project, I've intentionally narrowed down the scope, so I'm okay with what I'm at. There's stuff that I would change, of course. Like there's always stuff that you would change, but I'm pretty happy with it. I think the setting is sufficient. I think the sticking to the wall thing is actually pretty significant as far as like creating the feeling of being a ball of soot. I don't know why, but that just like does it for me in terms of like making you feel like you are playing as a little ball of soot. And I think it's sufficient. Can you do more? You can always do more, and it would have been nice to do more. Okay, those are the questions for this week. And now for this week's tip. You might not like this one, but it's been really helpful for me. I recommend it at some point, right? Not necessarily right now, whenever. The tip is to take a week away from gaming. Yeah, you heard me. And then play with new tools. So what I did, and by the way, I freaking love gaming, and I will never say stop gaming. No. No. But you take a week away from it, you might find some more productivity. You might find a pattern that works for you better. You can just kind of like get a breath of fresh air and view things from a clear lens and enjoy games differently, and it's nice. So basically what I did was I just replaced my evening gaming with working on art, like going to the library and learning to draw, right? Because I'm going to need those skills. And then it's like, it helps me fall asleep earlier, all this stuff. Fixed my sleep pattern. Hopefully that sticks. It'll probably get messed up after this trip, but it had a good impact. And that's why I'm recommending it. And then you come back around, you play, and you enjoy the games rather than just like sinking into some weird hole of numbly playing a game, right? And then play with new tools, because playing with new tools is a fun thing to do instead of gaming. Learn to draw, work on some music, whatever, do something relevant to your interests. But like taking a week off can have a pretty big impact. All right, that's everything I got for you. Thanks for tuning in. I will talk to you next week. Yeah, have a good one. Get out there, make some stuff, and have fun with it. Bye-bye.